In Britain and America, calling Israel's war on Gaza genocidal can get you labelled an extremist. But Israel themselves aren't exactly hiding it. This was part of Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech to the Israeli public on Sunday.
You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible. And we do remember, and we are fighting our brave troops and combatants who are now in Gaza or around Gaza and in all other regions in Israel are joining this chain of Jewish heroes, a chain that has started 3,000 years ago from Joshua ben Nun until the heroes of 1948, the Six-Day War, the 73 October War, and all other wars in this country. Our hero troops, they have one supreme main goal: to completely defeat the murderous enemy and to guarantee our existence in this country. We've always said, never again. Never again is now.
Now, the mention of the 1948 war will already be worrying to Palestinians. That was when 700,000 Palestinians were driven from their land in what they know as the Nakba, or catastrophe. But the scariest part of that speech was the biblical reference Netanyahu invoked. He said, quote, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you." Now, my knowledge of scripture is not fantastic, but many people have now pointed out that in the Hebrew Bible, that Amalekites are described as the enemy of the Israelites, and this is what the Israelites are implored to do to the Amalekites. Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. Right? So kill everyone, everything they own, all of them, men, women, infant and babies, right? Terrifying. For those unfamiliar with biblical references, 2 weeks ago, the former head of Israel's National Security Council expressed his genocidal intent in a more secular idiom in the Israeli newspaper Ynet News. Giora Eiland wrote this: Israel needs to create a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, compelling tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands to seek refuge in Egypt or the Gulf. In order for this to happen, Israel needs to demand 4 key points with greater determination than ever before. 1. The entire population of Gaza will either move to Egypt or move to the Gulf. From our perspective, every building in Gaza known to have Hamas headquarters underneath, including schools and hospitals, is considered a military target. 2. Every vehicle in Gaza is considered a military vehicle transporting combatants. Now, that's particularly chilling, seeing the scenes of the tank firing on a car as we did today. Therefore, there is no vehicular traffic, and it does not matter whether it is transporting water or other critical supplies. Number 3, the UN Secretary General has initiated humanitarian aid to Gaza. The Israeli condition for any aid should be a visit by the Red Cross to Israeli hostages and especially the civilians among them. Until this happens, no aid of any kind will be permitted to enter into Gaza. That is, by definition, collective punishment, a war crime. And number 4, intermediators with both diplomatic and military experience will be required to explain in detail these concepts to the rest of the world. It will not be possible to remove Hamas without exerting pressure, and if the Americans do not receive a clear and detailed explanation from Israeli officials and understand that Israel has no choice, it is comparable to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which led to the launch of an atomic bomb in Japan. So he's talking about an attack on Palestinians to the scale of the atomic bomb. And he concludes by saying this: as a result, Gaza will become a place where no human being can exist. And I say this as a means rather than an end. I say this because there is no other option for ensuring the security of the state of Israel. We are fighting an existential war. Now, you might say that's a former member of the National Security Council. Maybe he got extreme after he left office. Well, 972, which is a magazine they describe themselves for independent Israeli and Palestinian voices, they have just published that the Israeli Ministry of Information itself endorsed on the 13th of October, so a day after this article was written, endorsed as its suggested policy position that Gaza be completely cleared of all Palestinians. Right? So, as I say, the Israeli government is not hiding its genocidal intent. Yeah, Aaron, I really still think that, the way this is talked about in the Western media, the way Israel is talked about, just hasn't caught up with this, right? It's still just talked about like it's this normal liberal democracy. Oh, Israel's just like us. They've suffered a terrorist attack. What would they do? This is just counterterrorism. You've literally got the Prime Minister of Israel citing biblical passages which suggest we have to kill every man, woman, child, and baby. And you've still got Labour politicians saying, oh, Israel, we've got to support. I speak to people in Israel. They've got to defend themselves. It's completely divorced from reality. I do feel like if more people in Britain knew what the actual Prime Minister of Israel was saying, what the Information Ministry of Israel was saying, what Israeli politicians are openly saying, they're not hiding it. The kind of discourse we have about this conflict in this country would just seem so ridiculous.
Yeah, conservatives love to talk about the Judeo-Christian heritage that underpins the West. What you're seeing here, Michael, the rhetoric from Netanyahu in particular, is completely at odds with ideas of just war that we've had in Europe or within the Christian tradition since Augustine of Hippo. So you go back, 1,500 years. And just war theory, which also, by the way, comes out of Roman law, even the Romans had certain ideas that there are conventions of war which shouldn't be breached. Three of the key sort of cornerstone concepts, principles of just war, jus in bello, are distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, proportionality, and military necessity. So it's necessary to bomb this, right? We're bombing this place because Hamas are based there. So these are three big pillars: proportionality, distinction, military necessity, which have just been completely ignored by Israel, in fact. And then in rhetoric, Netanyahu is saying, well, we are ignoring them, and I'm making this rhetorical appeal to the Old Testament. So you're seeing an appeal to religious scripture which precedes ideas and ideals of just war in the Christian tradition. Very dark, Michael. Very dark. And look, that's not to say all the wars fought by Christian nations have been wonderful. Of course they haven't. But they claimed to uphold these principles. Even after 9/11, when the United States goes into Afghanistan, Iraq, they don't say, we will kill civilians, we don't care. They say we'll be proportionate. Of course, we're trying to kill combatants, not non-combatants. They say we will do things because it's militarily necessary. Right? We will be proportionate. Of course we'll be proportionate. If you look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that was at the center of the whole debate, right? Well, look, and I don't agree with using nuclear weapons in Japan in 1945, but those were the parameters of the debate. Tens of thousands of people have died in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but if we have an invasion of Japan by the United States, millions could die. It wasn't quite that simple. It was more about actually the Russians getting there first, but park that for a moment. That debate, that argument, was very much informed by ideas of just war, proportionality, distinction, military necessity. We are not now there with Israel, certainly not with regards to distinction and proportionality. And the fact that Europe is not calling this out, Michael, I think is a really important moment actually in human history. It's a really important moment. We are giving up on the things which apparently our civilization claimed it was committed to above all else. Not just for the last 10, 20, 50, 100 years, going back centuries. Going back centuries. And it's deeply, deeply concerning. We've had about 8,000 civilian casualties now, civilian deaths in Gaza. In Ukraine, since February 2022, according to a UN agency, you're looking at around 9,500 civilian deaths. So 9,500 versus 8,000 since October the 7th. That's only 23 days ago at the time of recording today. And I think you're right to say, yes, I don't think, Western media, Western politicians are being alive to what's going on here, but they bloody well should be, because this is a major, major shift. And it's even at odds with the stuff that you hear from conservatives, the Jordan Petersons, the Douglas Murrays. Israel is a part of the West because we share this common Judeo-Christian inheritance. Well, actually, what Netanyahu is saying is completely at odds with Christian ideas of just war. Completely at odds. We've never heard this kind of argument before from a European. I won't, obviously some regimes, I won't say them, but it's been very, very, very unusual, highly irregular. And isn't it interesting, I'll finish on this, Michael, that you can talk about holy war as long as you're wearing a tie and a suit and you're buying US weapons and you were educated in an American university. But heaven forbid you talk about a holy war wearing a dish dash or a keffiyeh, because then, of course, you're deplorable and you're not even human. You're not even human. You don't deserve the rights of a human, i.e. human rights. Yet you could do the precise same thing, quoting religious scripture, if you wear a suit and your interests happen to align with the United States. I think it tells you something quite significant, actually, about how we make sense of these things. And look, you can criticize Europe all you want. I do it. Can you imagine a European politician doing this? I can't. I really, really can't. And I think it speaks to the direction of Israel as a political entity. In 1948, when it was founded, I think around 1% of its population was Haredim, ultra-Orthodox. Some people say by 2050, you're looking at about 30, 40%. And of course, those are the voters who are the bedrock of two of the far-right parties who are in government right now with Netanyahu. That is the future of Israeli politics. And it begs the question, at what point will liberal democracies in Europe grasp, understand, communicate, convey to Israel that they are no longer on the same civilizational wavelength? I think personally that moment's already gone, but surely it's a matter of time. When you have somebody like Ben Gvir in charge of domestic security in Israel, surely people talk about Maloney on the far right or Salvini. They are progressives, they're libs compared to Ben Gvir. When is the penny going to drop with Europeans, with our political and media class? It has to happen, surely, at some point.
The Nazis spoke in a very genocidal fashion. Could we also say that about European politicians with relation to sort of empire and in colonial era, where they would talk, openly, not in the language of sort of just war, but in the language of these people are fundamentally our enemies and we can kill as many as we want and who cares?
That's precisely how Europeans, not always, but very often, conducted war with non-Europeans, right? Whether that was the Spanish in South America, whether that was, the British in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the Germans with the Herero. So absolutely. But those kinds of arguments being made at an intra-European level have been incredibly rare. I know people like to talk about, Europe's constantly at war with itself, which it has been. It's not a phenomenon you see, for instance, in East Asia. But the idea of conduct, proportionality, military necessity, combatant, non-combatant. Okay, civil wars are a bit different. So you might say the 30 Years' War in Germany, civil wars are a bit different. But intrastate wars between European nations, they have. I can't think of many examples where they've made these kinds of appeals, both to scripture that Netanyahu's done, but also that's aligning with the facts on the ground. I can't think of many examples. Of course, Europeans in non-European places, it's incredibly common. You can go all the way back to Christopher Columbus. And of course, just war theorists actually started to respond to this as well. There was a big debate in 16th century Spain about, well, actually, these are humans. You can't necessarily treat them in a certain way. And that itself, the fact we're even talking about, 16th century Spain's treatment of the Western Hemisphere, the fact that's even in the conversation, I think shows you how deeply reactionary Israel's political class is now becoming. That's now in the conversation. Scary, scary stuff. We talk about post-modernity. No, think pre-modernity. Think 3, 4, 5, 600 years ago. That's the kind of ballpark you're in all of a sudden. And just because somebody wears a suit and tie and they went to an American university and because, they speak with a quasi-American English or American accent, just because they tick all those boxes, that doesn't make them any more concerning for me. As a phenomenon, Michael, I'm not going to lie, as a phenomenon, the future trajectory of Israel, as it moves towards theocracy, I wrote an article about this last year, which is, I think, primarily an outgrowth of the demographics of the country, more liberally minded, secularly minded Israelis, who are broadly the people that founded the country in 1948, they are having a very low birth rate of 1, 2 children. Ultra-Orthodox are having a birth rate of 7 to 8 children. And there's this line, of course, the religious shall inherit the earth. So people who are more progressively minded don't have the kids, and the people who are religious fundamentalists, they have lots of kids. That's not the case just in Israel. It's in many places, the United States too. Look at evangelical Christians. But that is the real concern for me, is that we're seeing a political, cultural context in Israel now, which is terrifying and completely alien to the West. Completely alien. in terms of how we've understood ourselves and behaved with regards to the rest of the world for the last 80 years. It is completely alien. It brings to mind, a book by John Gray, who I recently interviewed for Novara. It's done very well. Al-Qaeda and what it means to be modern. This idea of modernity must look like this. Well, actually, no, it can look like this. Maybe the future looks like the past. That's the kind of framing that comes to mind when I think about the future of Israeli politics.
My pushback was slightly, in terms of the hundreds of years versus the 80 years, because I do think that probably, looking back to when Britain had an empire, we would have talked in a very similar way. But I do agree this isn't what we're used to seeing in modern European politics, discussing, openly that you want to wipe out a people.